Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Justice Panel. We're so happy that you're here to join us today. And we have a couple of great panelists that will be talking, but we also want you to be part of the discussion. So please feel free to put questions in the chat if it's during during when the presenters are presenting, or there will be a question and answer period at the end, where we'll be able to do that as well. You'll be able to come off mute and talk. I am Amber Ramirez, and I am the Central Iowa Works Director at the United Way of Central Iowa, and I'll be moderating for you today. We have Betty Andrews, who is the President of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP, who will be talking with us today, and we also have Dennis Henderson, who is the Teach and Tech Coordinator at Broadlawns Medical Center. And really the ground rules for today, everyone entered on mute, so please stay on mute unless you mean to talk to us. Then you can of course come off mute and talk to us, but it's just easier for everyone if you stay on mute when you're not talking. And feel free to use the chat for questions. We will be talking about some difficult topics, so please just be respectful of one another. It is possible that we'll have different ideas on strategies and how to get things done, and that's fine. So please be part of the conversation, but stay respectful. And today's topic is justice. So day 15 of the equity challenge, we talked about the justice system. And if you missed it, please go back and see that day. There were some really quality articles that were shared. But there are several places in the justice system where bias can come into play. Today, we're going to focus more on reentry, so kind of the other side. When we talked about justice with the equity challenge, a lot of that was around the policing side and incarceration. So today we're going to talk a little bit more on the other side, once people are released. When people are given a sentence, they pay their time and they'll finish their fines. But then there are a lot of collateral consequences that come along with a criminal history as well. And those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Things like finding employment, housing, being able to volunteer, going into your child's school, licenses to start a business, ability to vote. All of these things have been affected by a criminal history. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So starting off, we're going to have Betty start off with a PowerPoint that'll give us a little bit of context for this conversation. So Betty, if you want to introduce yourself and get started, thank you.
Sure, Amber, thanks so much. I did want to appreciate you for reaching out to the NAACP for this presentation. I just want to make one distinction. I know that we're going to be talking about reentry, and I am looking forward to that conversation, but I believe my presentation was to kind of give an overview, just the disparities and challenges that we are working on and addressing generally. So I know we will pick up after me on the reentry conversation, and I certainly have lots of input on that part, but just kind of generally, I wanted to give people a sense of what is happening in the state of Iowa. So with that context, again, thanks for allowing me to be here. I'm also excited to see Brother Dennis Henderson here with me to have this conversation. It's good. I know we worked together quite a bit over the years. So thank you for being here. So we'll go ahead and start. So of course, my name is Betty Andrews. I'm president of the Iowa-Nebraska NAACP. And there are a few other descriptors there, but I do want to say that criminal justice reform, if I could call out one thing that is my passion, it would be criminal justice reform. And the reason is that it impacts the African-American community, and it impacts a lot of Iowans so immensely that it really, over the years has been a game changer, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so we can change what's happening in the criminal justice system. We can change a lot of things that are challenges for us. The NAACP's mission, just wanted to share that with you. The mission of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People is to ensure the political, educational, social, economic equality of rights for all people and to eliminate race-based discrimination. We do that with initiatives that we call game changers. And our game changers include economic sustainability, education, public safety and criminal justice, which we will talk about today, health, and voting and political voting rights and political representation, and expanding youth engagement. So, but for today's program, we're talking about public safety and criminal justice. So equitable dispensation of justice for all, and just addressing disproportionate incarceration, racially motivated policing, and racial bias and discrimination within the criminal justice system. And that is where we focus our work, which is quite broad, quite frankly. And I also wanted to just remind people of the urgency of now. Of course, you recognize, hopefully you recognize Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, of course, Mr. Floyd. A lot of people may not recognize, but that third gentleman is my nephew, Manny Ellis. He actually was murdered by police also in Tacoma, Washington earlier this year after just walking down the street. So, and I also just want to emphasize that I know we talk about those names right now, but it goes on and on. So wanted to acknowledge that. So criminal justice reforms with and initiatives in the NAACP. There are a lot of disturbing facts out there about criminal justice, but I wanted to just take a moment and just kind of point you in terms of where we are in the NAACP and our work locally. So of course, recently you, I'm sure, heard about Executive Order 7. The NAACP was instrumental in obtaining that executive order, and we are hugely proud of that. But for far too long, people who had served their time and came back into our population were not allowed to vote. So we are grateful that we are now in a place where most people with felony convictions after they have completed probation and parole can vote. Our goal is also to eliminate racial profiling. So in the criminal justice system, one of the stats that I often talk about is that African Americans in the state of Iowa are far more likely than their white counterparts to be incarcerated. And that rate is for every one white person within the criminal justice system, there are 11 African Americans in the criminal justice system. That's a daunting fact, but it was even more daunting just a few years ago when that ratio was 1 to 14. And so one of the ways that we address that is taking it from the beginning of the process. And that has to do with their first contact with the police and dealing with racial profiling. And what we found is that in the state of Iowa, according to reports from the ACLU and others, that African Americans are stopped exponentially more often than white people. I believe that rate is 1 to 7 in relationship to drug usage and marijuana usage. And the challenge is that African Americans and other Americans tend to use drugs at the same rate. So that's one of the things that we're addressing. We also address, as I mentioned, reentry advocacy. Of course, the voting rights executive order number 7 was big on our list, but then also addressing issues like when someone is in prison and they take courses and think that they're going to get out and do an apprenticeship, and they're actually prevented because of their conviction. So we've worked on that issue as well with the governor's focus group. And then we also address sentencing reform. So in the state of Iowa, the sentencing for crack cocaine and powder cocaine is different. It is double for crack cocaine, even though they're essentially the same drug, and even though well, and I shouldn't say even though, the part of that reasoning is, or part of what we look at is that drug, crack cocaine, is because it's a cheaper drug. It is the choice for people of color, just because it's cheaper and there tends to be less funds available, as opposed to cocaine, which tends to be the drug of choice for white Americans. So we're addressing those sentencing reforms. We're also addressing how people are charged with sentencing. So an African American may be charged for the same crime at a much higher rate than their white counterparts. And oftentimes African Americans, again, rather than facing an all-white jury, or because there are lack of funds, may tend to plead down to the level that the white person was charged for in the first place. So those are some of the things that we're addressing. We also address bail and pretrial release. And just one example in that area, if you are able to get out on bail, and usually the difference between someone being able to get out on bail or not is their financial situation. And if you are able to pay whatever it takes to get out on bail, or you have someone in your family that can put up a home or something like that so that you can get out on bail, you actually have the opportunity to then take some methods that will show the judge that you are working on being a better person. So for instance, you may be able to seek drug treatment, or do some type of retribution to the victim and that kind of thing, versus if you are sitting in jail and unable to get out of jail, you are not able to show that improvement. So that's another area that we are working on. And then of course, equity in jails. And then of course, education and awareness just around these issues. We also address the school to prison pipeline, dealing with even, some of these inequities start in school and start because there are officers in schools, and behavior that was once considered normal schoolhouse horse playing is now criminalized. And so we work in addressing that as well. Okay, and then some of our accomplishments, as I just mentioned, were Executive Order number 7, which grants those with a felony record to be the right to vote. And then also we've been working very strongly on anti-racial profiling ordinances, and to even go broader, unbiased policing ordinances in Des Moines. And now we literally today, I believe Coralville is going to pass and at first reading an unbiased policing ordinance, and along with Iowa City and a number of other locations around the state. We have also been very active with the Governor's Focus Committee on Criminal Justice Reform in pushing the governor, and I say that with all due respect, but pushing her to address these issues around, again, racial profiling, which is at the beginning of the process. And in doing so, we have now, as of 2 weeks ago, not quite 2 weeks ago, released the Governor's Focus Committee's recommendations on unbiased policing, which include anti-racial profiling. So if you haven't seen that information, please feel free to contact me and we will provide that information to you. And then of course, we work with our police around the state. We are in partnership with the Iowa Chiefs Association with regard to an equity in law enforcement task force. And then we help, of course, resolve issues around criminal justice. And we have, the NAACP has worked just in the last 5 years since I've been president, over 15 criminal justice laws and reforms that we have successfully been able to get either passed or put into policy. Just a couple of pictures on the voter signing of the executive order number 7. I also want to point out is that I know that there was a lot of publicity around getting the order signed, and that's important. One of the things I wanted to mention there is that a lot of times people don't understand that it takes more work than people tend to see the end. They don't see the journey. And so it really was a multi-year journey to get that passed. But then after that, the work continues. So after this, the NAACP petitioned the Secretary of State's office to update its materials immediately so that people could register to vote. And then we also petitioned them to convene the Voter Registration Form Commission, which we successfully got them to do that. And they have actually updated that voter registration form so that it is more welcoming to people who have felony records. And there is another meeting scheduled in which they will take another look based on the data from our election. So that's one huge thing, talking about reentry. The other thing that we do a lot around is banning the box when it comes to reentry. That is a piece of legislation that we are interested in getting enacted. The governor's focus group on criminal justice reform did make a recommendation around this as well. But we all know that employment is one of the factors in which allows people to safely re-enter society, and then also keeps them out of trouble, along with housing, and then of course, making sure that they have their citizenships right. And I mentioned racial profiling already. I mentioned the governor's working group on criminal justice reform. I did want to point out the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities is an opportunity. We just held that a couple weeks ago. And it's where we announced the governor's working group reforms. But this is an opportunity to bring people together who are interested in criminal justice reform. So that includes the people that are working as practitioners, law enforcement, judges, people in the parole, probation, et cetera, any area of the criminal justice system are working on it, along with advocates, those who are formerly incarcerated. Dennis, I know you're a regular at our at the Iowa Summit on Justice and Disparities. And then we also bring in national experts. So we brought in representatives from Georgetown University, and then Paul Butler, who is the author of the book called The Chokehold, which is right up there with Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow. So we make sure that we have these conversations, but not just a conversation, as a strategy to move things forward. So I'm just going to kind of skip a couple of slides because I think I was supposed to be at about a little over 15 minutes. So I just want to take a moment and say thank you. That's a very, very light context of our work, but as we continue, we certainly need help. Feel free to contact us, and we can certainly talk to you about how you can get involved. So thank you.
Thank you, Betty. I appreciate you taking the time to give us a little bit of context for the conversation and talk about some of the work that's been happening in the Central Iowa or larger Iowa community. One of the things that you brought up was that employment is an important factor in lowering recidivism or having people go back to prison. So Dennis, that brings me to you. Broadlawns has been quite the advocate with the Teach and Tech programs in bringing new populations to work into the hospital. So do you want to talk a little bit about your role at Broadlawns and how Teach and Tech work?
Okay, so most of the time what happens is when we create laws, we're intentional about the laws and what our outcomes, what we want our outcomes to be. Well, Teach and Tech works the same way. It's a creation of Wayne Ford and Jody Jenner. And what they did is they went out to Baltimore, they came out and took a project, an anchor program that they had out in Baltimore, brought it back here, took it up a step, because instead of giving people entry-level jobs, what they wanted to do is put people on a career path. So what we do is we make sure that we recruit people to come into the programs. People have to have barriers to employment, and sometimes that could be people with backgrounds, criminal backgrounds. So we have a good relationship with DHS, and we make sure that the people that we get vetted into this process are people that will fit well into the hospital setting. Because one of the major things about our program that I really bought into is that not only do they get the skills, but they also get the employment. So everyone that's been through our program, we've been through 9 adult cohorts and 5 juvenile cohorts. Everybody that went through the program was offered a job. Whether they took it or not is a different thing, but that's what I bought into. And one of the things that Wayne and Jody were really adamant about was making sure that the person who coordinated that program was from that community that they were reaching out to. So we give extra kudos to people who are in the 50314 and 50116 area codes, because we wanted the hospital to reflect the community that it served. So it was important that we reached out to those folks. And one thing that we found through this process is that once these guys get the skills, if it doesn't work out with Broadlawns, they have something that they can fall back on. So they're not really quick to get back into that lifestyle that they had prior to coming to our program. So that's one thing that I'm really proud of, because we are able to put people in nursing homes, put people in different hospitals. Because if you had a criminal background, for instance, and you got DHS approved, as long as you didn't commit another crime, you are still DHS approved. So you could take that skill and you could utilize that in another place. And with this pandemic, it is very important that we get people involved in the healthcare field.
Thank you, Dennis. It really has been game-changing in Central Iowa, what Broadlawns has done, and how, as an employer, you've been able to look at criminal histories and decide on an individual basis. And I know a lot of people will say that they decide on an individual basis, but at Broadlawns, you can actually see how people, whether or not you hire someone, is based on how long it's been, the motivation of the individual, if the crime has anything to do with the position. So I know that's what you do. Can you talk a little bit about the process as an employer? Was that easy for Broadlawns to make that adjustment, or has it been hard? How has it been as an employer?
Oh, it's a hard process. But one of the things that really helped us is the decision came from the top. So it was a top-down decision. So a lot of people ended up buying into it because it was a vision of the CEO of Broadlawns. So that helped quite a bit. And once it was really difficult because your HR department, HRs are black and white, if I can be candid. So, we got 1,300 employees here. So certain things that go on, you really need a person like me to buffer those situations, because our clientele had come in with so many needs and there's so much support that HR is not capable of being able to do, because they just have too many duties, too many policies and regulations that they got to go by. So I'm able to get out and get into people's personal space And, so if they're having problems, we can wing them in and say, hey, listen, let's try this, or we can get them resources that they need. If there's many a times that people were ready to quit because they couldn't afford to pay their Iowa Power bill. Well, I know people in general assistance, so we get them over there, and so we get their Iowa Power bill, because you can't function well in a class setting, and it's a lot of information because we fast track you. It's like a full-time job for 2 months. So we get you in and get you your certificates and get you back out. So it's like bam, bam, bam. You got to get them in there and get them out of there. So they need those supports, and you have to have people in places to render those supports to make this a successful program.
Thank you. Betty, what are some obstacles that the NAACP has identified for the reentry community, and what are you working on in the community around this area?
So of course, if you kind of look at it as a overall picture, it is the mindset, working with not only the mindset of the community, as Dennis is mentioning, but also working with the mindset of individuals coming back into the community on making sure that people are accepted. So Dennis is absolutely right, working around making sure that people have jobs, and that people understand that when he mentioned how long the individual consideration, so how long it's been since people were actually convicted of that crime. Studies show that after about 7 years, people are no more likely to recommit a crime or recidivate after about 7 years post release. Also, taking a look at areas in terms of addressing actually what the crime was. I mean, sometimes a felony looks worse than it actually is. I recall there's one actually employer in the Des Moines area who had, and thankfully they had banned the box, but they had an employee that was convicted of murder. But taking a look at that crime and realizing that it was actually closer to a manslaughter type crime, and that it was something that this person would absolutely never do again. And quite frankly, the person had experienced a major loss because of that, and they were able to hire that person. Other areas that we look at are, of course, education, making sure that people have access to education and when they re-enter society. And then also taking a look at fines and fees and all of those things that could actually augur, and I say augur, pull people back into the system. So if there are any outstanding fines and fees, those sometimes are not because people don't want to pay those fees. They are because people are unable economically to pay those fees. When you think about the length of time that specifically African Americans are out of employment after they come back into the community, that could be years. And so it is not their intent not to pay, they're just unable to do that. And then also issues around driver's license, making sure that number one, when people come out of the system, they don't have a driver's license, and that lack of mobility is a huge disadvantage to them in finding employment. And then also addressing issues around the fact that there are many I'd say civic violations that, like for instance, not paying child support. So if you have been sitting in the prison system for a number of years, you're unable to pay child support. And so, but that's a reason to revoke a license. So it kind of just goes on and on and on. And there's a study, and I'm sorry, I can't cite the source, but it talks about how there are thousands of laws that are set up against people who are looking for a second chance. And so the NAACP strives to break through those barriers and address those laws. One other thing I think about is, when you talk about employment, and so an African American with a criminal background is, and I apologize, let me say that again. A white person with a criminal background is more likely to get a call back often than a Black person without a criminal background. So if you add a criminal background to that mix, it's huge. I mean, and it really is a detriment for those people who may have made a mistake or made a poor choice and are now looking to change their lives around.
Yeah, that's all very true. Dennis, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your own reentry story and some of the obstacles that you came up against, and what were some of the things that really helped you as you were coming back and reentering into the community?
Okay, so I'm gonna piggyback off of what Betty was just saying. Okay, so there's three major things that people have to start thinking about before they re-enter. It's employment, it's housing, and it's transportation. And our system has set up barriers in all those scenarios. So, a lot of people don't understand, even your juvenile record can come into play on your background. So when employers are looking at your background, they also get to see what you did as a juvenile. Now, according to, what we hear, that's supposed to be expunged and it's not supposed to be used when you become an adult. But this is what's happening because I'm in on the background checks. So one of the hardest things that people are going to have to do is our society has to figure out, are we really rehabilitating these folks? Because they tell us that you go through the parole process if you qualify to get released. It stands to reason that you've already passed the litmus test to be back in society. So why doesn't society facilitate the re-entry process instead of building up these barriers? Because all these things affect the other things. If I can't get my license, I can't get to the job. If I can't get to the job, I can't afford wherever I'm staying. So all these things are affecting one another. If I don't have a place to stay, what's the use? So we put these people in these situations where, they're more likely to recidivate than not. Trust me, I did 25 years in prison. 17 and a half of it was in some form of segregation. If I didn't have the supports of Wayne Ford and other people like Doug Reitgart, I would never be in the position I'm in today, because there were people who looked out after me. When I lost my job, I had a seasonal job when I first got out. I didn't work enough quarters to qualify for unemployment when it became winter. So it was Urban Dreams and Wayne Ford that gave me an opportunity to shovel snow, cut grass, paint offices, this so I could pay my rent. And I was staying in an attic. I stayed in the attic the first 3 years I was out, so I wouldn't be so far, I could always afford my rent. That's what was on my mind. 95% of the people that come out with the intent to do right. But if you can't meet your obligations, then that's when they start throwing rocks at the penitentiary, if that makes sense.
Can I just, to Dennis's point, I just wanted to reiterate one particular piece. In the last few years, the NAACP has actually worked with both Governor Branstad and Governor Reynolds to enact legislation, successfully enacted legislation around juvenile records sealing. And that is now the law. But the challenge is that and not only for that, but also for records that have been expunged as an adult or after so much time are supposed to be sealed and those types of things. But what you have is these firms that that do background checks. And once they take that picture or have that in their files, it never leaves their files. So even if the government has, it's no longer on the government's website, it's no longer available through the government, it's still available through those firms. And that, there are people that have been expunged, but still are affected by that and still have to kind of prove themselves. And so that's part of the work that we're still doing to ensure not only that the government records are those cease, but then also legislation that addresses these companies that continue to add these to the reports that they're providing employers and people who are looking at housing inquiries as well.
That's really helpful to know. Elsie just messaged me that there are a couple of questions in the chat. So Elsie, if you'll go ahead and ask those questions.
Yes, we have a question from Carl, and he's asking, are there any figures showing how many former felons actually voted in the latest election?
I apologize. I think I heard static on her.
Yeah, I think the question was, are there any statistics around, since we changed the voting rights legislation this last cycle, are there any stats around how many people actually were able to vote or voted in this last election?
So we are still waiting on those stats. And I'm hesitating because I'm trying to remember the number, but I know that in mid-October, we received information that there were several thousand people, and I apologize, I wanna say it's 20,000. I probably need to do a quick look up, but there were, I'm sorry, it wasn't 20,000, I apologize. It was probably, it was 2,500, and that was during the month of August. So during the month of August, about 2,500 people had registered to vote that had a felony background. So out of 35,000 in the first less than the month. And so we are looking to hear what is ensued in September, October, and then also November, because of course in Iowa, we have same day registration. So that is something that we are looking at as well. We just have not received those numbers yet from the Secretary of State's office. Can I also address there's a question in chat from Heidi Pierce. There's a couple of things I wanted to make sure that I address. Her question is it actually helpful to ban the box? And it's a question mark. I just, and she's asking about, there were people that actually had the box banned, and then they did the background check after the interview, and they were not hired. So here's what I want to say about ban the box. Ban the box does not prevent an employer from actually doing a background check. Usually what ban the box does is either move that record check until either the time of the interview or after the interview, or to the time of the offer. And it is designed to give people a chance to talk about their skills and what they are able to do. The employer still ultimately has the opportunity to reject an application. But then I also wanted to comment on, because there are a lot of recent studies that claim that ban the box is actually hurtful to people with felony backgrounds. And I want to be really clear that that is not the case. What is the case is that banning the box pulls back the covers on covert racism, so undercover racism. And you can, before, we don't have ban the box in this state yet, but before ban the box was enacted in other places, people could use that to discriminate. But since ban the box is enacted in some places, people employers now no longer can use that for cover. So what they're actually seeing is additional discrimination out other places within that employment process. So in that sense, that's where the hurt comes in. That's how it hurts. But it's not the banning the box that's hurting people. It is the discrimination that the employers are engaging in. So I just want to be really clear that ban the box does not hurt people with felony background. It helps.
And
thank you so much.
Let me speak on that issue. One of the things that I found is that employers set up policies. And if you have a policy that doesn't allow you to hire people with felony backgrounds, when you find out that they have a felony background, you're still able to do it under that guise. What I think that we should do is we should work on getting these policy changes, because there's a lot of fields that if I got out today and I wanted to get into the insurance field, which is a lucrative field and there's a lot of opportunities there, I couldn't do it because of my felony background. Now, if you ban the box, all that does is give my hopes up that I'm going to be able to persuade these people. But as you know, there's a big umbrella in the insurance world. So it's not just changing, one policy, it's changing a culture that you have to deal with. And this is what we're running into, is because we have these systemic racism issues. Mm-hmm. And if I can, I'm gonna digress a little bit. When I heard Joni Ernst say there was no systemic racism, I was appalled, because if you look at all the data, I mean, we have the crack and powder cocaine. Then we had the meth epidemic. The way these two issues were addressed were different. The only difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine is baking soda. Now, when people were on meth, what they did is they took the precursors and they made it hard for you to get a hold of these precursors. Never did they ever attempt to ban baking soda or make you use your ID to get baking soda. They gave us what they did, they enhanced the penalties. So here we go with meth. Now all of a sudden we have these drug courts that people, and meth is predominantly a white drug. Crack was predominantly a black drug. Then you go to the fact that Iowa, for over 2 decades, has led the country in disproportionate incarceration. Betty said earlier, we use at the same rate, but Blacks are arrested, charged, and go to prison 8 times more than whites. So that right there shows you that this data she wasn't processing this data, because it is systemic racism. And if you're intentional about the crimes, then you have to be intentional about the solutions. If I say that systemic racism doesn't exist, then it's impossible for me to solve the problem.
And Dennis, I just want to point out that not only does systemic racism exist, racism exists. So that's a tough and a lethal combination for people of color.
Yeah, because justice is supposed to be blind, but the juries are not blind. Judges are not blind. And this is reflected in our numbers.
Thank you both. There are a few more questions in the chat. Elsie, are you gonna go ahead and read those to us?
Yes, Annette is asking, is there a time limit that a felony conviction will stay on your background check?
It's supposed, certain crimes are supposed to have like a 7-year limitation, but the way that background checks, and I'm telling you this out of experience, all the numbers go out the window. When people, they go into these places that do the background, get the background information, and when it comes back with everything that you've ever done, including your juvenile history. So, and a lot of times it goes into what you're charged with. So we know that prosecutors overcharge people all the time. So what ends up happening is you'll get brought in, the prosecutor will charge you with first-degree robbery, knowing that it was probably a second-degree robbery, and then they whittle the charges down. So a major problem is that this information is out there and it's accessible to employers. And that's where the problem comes in.
And so just in answering your question from the NAACP standpoint, I am not aware, unless a record is expunged or falls under one of the areas in which it is removed at a certain time, I'm not aware of it falling off. I do want to say also that to Dennis's point, that oftentimes the reason that these firms have information on your charges is because they also they use the newspapers. And so a lot of times there are charges there. It doesn't, they don't report the part that says all charges were dropped. And then also there are some firms that have access to systems that even go down to a traffic ticket. And so even that sometimes can come back to bite people. And certainly, again, if you're dealing with discrimination and you need an excuse to eliminate a potential employee, you can cite anything in their record to do so.
Yeah, and I apologize. I didn't mean that it fell off, but employers certain employers cease to use your record after 7 to 10 years. That's
yeah, there may so Dennis, just to kind of expound on that, because of that research that says that after so long, people are no more likely to recidivate. There are employers that voluntarily don't use the convictions that are a certain age or a certain amount of years old. Yeah.
Thank you both. Yeah, so it is interesting. Working with employers, each employer does do a different thing, and there are different rules for each employers. And I do think it's interesting I've read some reports about new background check companies where the companies actually don't even know about what the criminal history is. They just put in what they want to know, and it just returns back those specific charges if the employer wants to hear about certain charges. So like if you're going to be a taxi driver and you just want to know about OWIs, then just those come back and no other charges come back. So there are some advancements happening that I think would be interesting. We are getting towards the end of our session. We have about 4 minutes to wrap up. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists, we've talked about several things that obstacles, collateral consequences that get in the way when people are released. What do you want the people that are listening today to leave with? What are some action steps that we can take as community members to try to help to get rid of some of these obstacles and make it a little easier for people as they reenter?
So I would just say that keep in mind that many of us have made mistakes, and usually that's when we're younger. But because people make mistakes, they should not have to carry a scarlet letter for the rest of their lives. People may have made bad decisions, but if they have paid their debt to society, and in the case of African Americans, to be real, oftentimes they overpay. And then once they've paid that debt, then they really should be afforded the opportunity to have a second chance. In terms of people getting involved, this is actually a good place to start. Where you're here, if you're interested in more involvement, certainly reach out to the NAACP. And then also, make sure that, if you just get on some mailing lists for active advocacy organizations, they'll send you when it's appropriate to call your legislator about these issues. So just kind of stay vigilant. And if you are an employer, also take a second look at your practices and be an advocate from within. And because there's plenty of opportunity to say, why did Mike get that and not Jamal? So ask those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Dennis, any last takeaways that you'd like to leave us with?
Okay, I'm here today because I was given an opportunity. And I believe that is the geist of what we need to be doing with these people, these returning citizens. We have to provide opportunities for these guys to get into jobs, not that they can just exist, but jobs where they can thrive and participate in the American dream like I do. Like I said, I started out in an attic, and went to an apartment, and now I'm in a house. And I'm living the American dream. But if I never had this opportunity, if I wasn't blessed to have mentors and people that support me now, I would probably be a recidivist. So my whole thing is, let's get these guys some opportunities, give them a chance, and I think we'll be better off in the long run.
Thank you. I want to thank both Betty and Dennis for your very wise words today. You're very passionate in this area, and we really appreciate everything you've had to say. I want to also thank everybody for attending.